The courtroom was alive with chatter, the air thick with anticipation. Lawyers stood in front of their respective tables, gesturing animatedly to their clients, while the judge remained behind the bench, silently observing the scene. The case was high-profile, a corporate dispute over land rights that had everyone in town talking. But the moment Clint Eastwood stepped into the room, the atmosphere shifted. He wasn't wearing a suit, but a weathered leather jacket and jeans, his presence commanding immediate attention. At first, there was a moment of disbelief. The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward him. Clint, at 75, had seen more than his fair share of battles, but today, it wasn't a gunfight or a showdown in some wild town. Today, he was here for something different. Clint Eastwood. In a courtroom? This ought to be good, whispered a reporter in the back. The judge, Judge Thompson, a man in his mid-50s with a reputation for being tough but fair, looked up from his papers and couldn't help but chuckle. His eyes scanned Clint from head to toe, skepticism written all over his face. He'd seen many cases, but never one quite like this. This should be interesting, he muttered, as Clint made his way to the defendant's table. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The court reporter, behind her machine, subtly glanced up, sensing the tension in the air, though she wasn't about to make a public spectacle of it. Clint walked with the same purposeful gait that had made him famous, his face weathered by years of tough decisions and even tougher circumstances. His once sharp jawline was now softened by age, but the fire in his eyes remained as sharp as ever. Mr. Eastwood, the judge finally said, his voice measured. I take it you're representing yourself today? Clint didn't blink. That's right, Your Honor, he said, his voice calm, steady, and sure, but there was something beneath the surface. Something unspoken. The judge raised an eyebrow. A little unusual, wouldn't you say? You do realize that this is a serious case, don't you? Clint looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the prosecutor and the defense, then back to the judge. He didn't flinch, didn't show any signs of nervousness. I'm not new to serious, Your Honor, he said simply, taking his seat. Judge Thompson raised his hand slightly in mock salute, his skepticism clear. Well, let's see how serious we can get. The opposing attorney, Richard Green, an arrogant corporate lawyer known for his cutthroat approach, couldn't suppress a smirk. He was younger than Clint by at least a decade, and yet, in that moment, he almost looked like a man who could be intimidated by Clint's sheer presence. Green adjusted his tie, preparing for what he expected to be a simple win. This was a case about land disputes between a corporation and Clint's family, a case Clint was bound to lose. At least, that's what everyone in the room assumed. Clint sat at the defendant's table, his eyes never leaving Judge Thompson, despite the occasional snickers from the gallery. There was a stillness about him that had always commanded respect, even when others didn't understand his methods. He wasn't here for glory or showmanship. He was here for justice. For his late wife, for his family, and for what he believed was right. As the judge banged his gavel to begin the proceedings, Clint let out a breath, steadying himself. This wasn't a Hollywood set, no, this was real life, and Clint wasn't the character everyone thought he was. He was no longer the gritty, lone cowboy of his past film roles. He was a man with a mission. We are gathered here today for the case of Eastwood versus Lender Enterprises, a matter concerning land rights and alleged corporate misconduct. Mr. Eastwood, Judge Thompson's voice broke the silence, please present your case. Clint didn't rush. He stood up slowly, his back straight, and looked at the jury, making brief eye contact with each of them. They were a mix of people, some skeptical, some curious, but all of them wondering what Clint Eastwood was doing in this place, with no legal experience to speak of. His voice, when it came, was calm but firm. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm here today because this land belongs to my family. It's been in our blood for generations. But these people, he gestured toward the corporate lawyers, think they can just take it from us, like it doesn't mean anything. Clint paused, his face a mask of controlled emotion. I'm not here for a paycheck. I'm not here to make friends. I'm here because my wife, God rest her soul, believed in what was right. She fought for justice every day of her life. And I promised her I would keep fighting, even after she was gone. Judge Thompson's expression softened just slightly, though he kept his professionalism intact. Mr. Eastwood, I'm sure your passion for your cause is undeniable, but this is a courtroom. We follow procedure here. I trust you're familiar with the rules. Clint met his gaze. I'm familiar enough, Your Honor. He sat down and prepared for what came next. The first few hours of the trial went as expected. Clint's methods were unconventional, to say the least. He wasn't following the typical structure of opening statements, instead relying on emotional appeals that made even the most hardened jurors sit up and take notice. His arguments were simple, direct, and devoid of legal jargon. Clint had a way of getting to the heart of things, of exposing the truth in a way no polished lawyer ever could. And yet, Judge Thompson couldn't help but smile to himself. This wasn't the way he'd ever seen a courtroom unfold. Clint didn't have the polished charm of a professional lawyer, he had something much more rare, genuine conviction. And for the first time, he started to wonder if this old man, with his ragged clothes and rugged demeanor, might actually have a point. Maybe he wasn't just a cowboy in a courtroom after all. But Judge Thompson wasn't ready to admit that yet. There was no way this untrained man could outsmart the professionals in the room. Or was there? As the day continued, Clint's unexpected approach began to gnaw at the judge's confidence. This wasn't supposed to happen. The jury's reaction was a mix of intrigue and disbelief. Clint was making a case that was both personal and powerful. He wasn't playing by the rules, but then again, maybe that was what made him so damn effective. As the courtroom session drew to a close, Clint stood once more, ready for the next round of questioning. He turned toward the judge, who looked back at him, shaking his head with a bemused chuckle. Well, Mr. Eastwood, I've seen a lot in my time, but this is something else. Clint simply nodded, a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. It's just the beginning, Your Honor. The judge chuckled again, but this time, there was a glint of respect in his eyes. He was beginning to realize, Clint Eastwood was more than just an old man seeking justice. He was a force to be reckoned with. The trial was far from over, but Clint had already set the tone. And Judge Thompson, despite his doubts, couldn't help but admire the man's strategy. The question was no longer whether Clint could win, it was whether the system could keep up with him. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood had been many things in his life: actor, director, soldier, and, now, a man fighting for justice in a courtroom. But behind the steely gaze and the rough demeanor lay a past few truly knew, a past that had shaped him in ways even he didn't fully understand. It was a dusty summer afternoon when Clint first thought he might become a lawyer. He'd been a young man, full of ideals, back when he still believed that the world was black and white. But that belief was tested, just as it had been for so many others before him. As a boy, Clint grew up in the small town of Carmel, California, a place as picturesque as it was isolated. His father was a hard-working man, a farmer who believed in doing things the right way, and his mother was the heart of the family, always encouraging Clint to dream big. They taught him that every action had consequences, and that no matter what happened, you were always accountable for your choices. But then, tragedy struck. At the age of 18, Clint lost his mother to an illness that swept through their small town. His father, struggling with the loss, became withdrawn, his world crumbling as he tried to keep the family farm afloat. The weight of grief pressed down on Clint, but he pushed through, burying his emotions under a thick layer of stoicism, refusing to show weakness. It was during that time that Clint realized life wasn't as simple as he once thought. The world wasn't black and white, it was filled with shades of gray, where good intentions often clashed with harsh realities. He'd seen the law fail in his town, corrupt politicians taking advantage of people who couldn't afford to fight back, the wealthy elite using their power to push down the less fortunate. Clint dreamed of becoming a lawyer, of studying law and fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. But that dream was quickly shattered. The town's university was out of reach financially, and Clint didn't have the resources to make it happen. So, he did what anyone in his position might do. He took a job at a local ranch and worked for the next few years, trying to save up for his future. But life had other plans. The day Clint turned 21, he received a letter that changed everything. His father had passed away suddenly, leaving Clint to take care of the family farm. There was no time for law school now. There was no time for anything other than survival. In the years that followed, Clint grew older, his heart hardened by the weight of responsibility. He took on work that kept him away from home, from the life he once dreamed of, but he did it because there was no other choice. He fought battles of a different sort, physical ones, where words were useless, and actions spoke louder than any lawyer's argument. And that was when Clint's life as a man of action began. He fought in wars. He fought on the streets. And through it all, he became a man who believed in justice, not from books, but from experience. It wasn't until he met Lisa that Clint's life took another turn. Lisa was a lawyer herself, a fierce advocate for the underdog who believed that the law could change the world if wielded with care and intention. She was everything Clint wasn't, educated, composed, and unwavering in her belief that things could be fixed through the legal system. At first, Clint had been skeptical, dismissing her idealism as naive. But over time, he began to see the merit in her perspective. She helped him understand that justice wasn't just about fighting for what was right, it was about knowing the system, using it to your advantage, and pushing back when it was broken. But Lisa wasn't just a mentor to Clint, she became something more. Their connection grew, slowly at first, and then like wildfire. They were two people from opposite worlds, yet somehow, they found a common ground. She showed him how the law could be a weapon for good, a tool that, if used properly, could change the course of someone's life. With her by his side, Clint started to believe again, believe that he could make a difference, that he could fight in a way that didn't involve a gun or fists. In the years they were together, Clint started to learn the law, not in the formal sense of a law school education, but in the real, practical sense. Lisa taught him about cases, precedents, and the intricacies of legal strategy. He saw the power in the law, how it could bend and twist, how it could either help or hurt people, depending on how it was used. Lisa's passion for justice rubbed off on him, and he soon found himself taking on small cases, helping Lisa with research, and gaining the respect of others in the legal world. But tragedy struck again. Lisa was diagnosed with cancer, a battle she fought bravely, but ultimately lost. Clint was left devastated. She had been his anchor, the one who taught him how to fight for something more than himself. She was gone, and Clint was left with a void that nothing could fill. Her death became Clint's turning point. He could no longer sit idly by. She had always believed in justice, and he had promised her that he would continue fighting, not for glory, but for the people who needed it most. That's when Clint decided to take on a case of his own, a case that had been brewing for years. The corrupt company that had wronged his family, stripping them of their land, had now become a personal vendetta. Clint wasn't just fighting for legal justice anymore, he was fighting for the memory of Lisa and the principles she had instilled in him. And that's how he ended up here, sitting in a courtroom, representing himself in a case that everyone thought he was destined to lose. Clint wasn't intimidated. He wasn't scared of the opposing lawyer, Richard Green, who had years of experience in the courtroom. Clint knew something Green didn't. Sometimes, the greatest battles aren't fought with expertise, but with heart. As Clint sat at the defendant's table, his mind wandered back to the days with Lisa, to the lessons she had taught him. He could hear her voice in his head, guiding him through the legal jargon, reminding him to focus on the truth. This case was bigger than land. It was about redemption, justice, and honoring a woman who had believed in him when no one else did. The door to the courtroom creaked open, and Clint snapped back to the present. Judge Thompson, who had been skeptical about Clint's decision to represent himself, glanced at him with a mixture of curiosity and doubt. Clint stood up slowly, his back straight, and his eyes locked onto the judge's. Today, he wasn't just Clint Eastwood, the actor, the icon. Today, he was a man fighting for what was right, no matter the odds. "I'm ready, Your Honor," Clint said. The judge nodded, though his gaze lingered for a moment longer than usual. There was something about Clint that was impossible to ignore, a quiet strength that even he couldn't dismiss. "Let's proceed, Mr. Eastwood," Judge Thompson said, his voice betraying a flicker of respect. Clint's battle had only just begun. But one thing was certain, he was ready. The courtroom was tense, the air charged with a sense of impending conflict. The first few days of the trial had gone surprisingly well for Clint. His unorthodox methods had shaken the system a bit, but there was still a long road ahead. It was clear now that the fight wasn't just about land rights, it was about principle. And Clint was prepared to fight to the end. Clint sat at the defendant's table, his fingers gently tapping against the wood. He had never been one to back down from a fight, whether it was on screen or in life. But this was different. This wasn't some western where good and bad were clearly defined, it wasn't a movie where the hero always came out on top. This was real, and Clint wasn't sure if he could win this one. But for the first time in years, he wasn't doing this for himself. He was doing it for Lisa. He was doing it for his family. Across the courtroom, Richard Green, the opposing attorney, stood with an air of smug confidence. Green was young, ambitious, and knew how to play the game. He had the resources, the experience, and the support of a powerful corporation behind him. He had no intention of letting an old cowboy like Clint Eastwood derail his case. Green had watched Clint closely over the last few days, and he had underestimated him at first. The old man didn't play by the rules, and that made Green uncomfortable. He couldn't afford to let that happen. His corporation was counting on him to win, and he wasn't going to let some has-been actor ruin everything they had worked for. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Green began, his voice smooth and practiced, "you've heard the emotional speeches from Mr. Eastwood. I understand his passion for this land. But passion doesn't make someone right. The facts are simple. The land in question has been in the hands of lender enterprises for years, and we have all the legal documentation to prove it." Clint's eyes narrowed as Green spoke. He had heard this argument 100 times over the past few days. It was the same line they had used to justify their claim on his family's land. Legal documentation, red tape, and loopholes, they all meant nothing. This wasn't about legalities. This was about legacy, about honor. But the jury was listening, and Clint could see the doubt creeping into their minds. He had to do something. He had to remind them of the truth. "Your Honor," Clint said, standing up slowly, "I'll be brief, because I know I'm not here to make speeches like my opponent." He turned to the jury, locking eyes with each of them. "But I'll tell you this, no amount of paperwork or fancy arguments can change the fact that this land belongs to my family. It's not about money. It's not about power. It's about what's right. What's just. This land is a part of my blood, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take it." There was a moment of silence, and for the first time, Clint saw the jury shift in their seats. He wasn't just fighting for a piece of property, he was fighting for something far more important, his family's dignity. His late wife's legacy. The values that had been instilled in him since childhood. Clint sat back down, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the pressure mounting. This wasn't just a courtroom battle, this was a battle of wills. And Clint had one thing Green didn't, unshakable resolve. Judge Thompson, who had been quietly observing the exchange, cleared his throat. "Mr. Eastwood, please refrain from personal attacks in your statements. Stick to the facts, as we discussed." Clint nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." He sat back in his chair, but the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. Green was quick to respond. "Mr. Eastwood has no real understanding of the law, Your Honor. He's using emotional tactics to sway the jury, and that's all he's doing here. He's not qualified to represent himself, and it's clear that his lack of legal knowledge is a major disadvantage to this case." Clint stood again, his voice calm but firm. "Maybe I don't know the law the way you do, Mr. Green. But I know what's right. And sometimes, the law doesn't have all the answers. I'm not here to talk about the law, I'm here to talk about what's just." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "You can argue all you want about technicalities, but this land is mine. It's been in my family for generations, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else take it." The room was silent, all eyes on Clint. Even Judge Thompson, who had been skeptical from the beginning, couldn't hide the faint flicker of admiration in his eyes. Clint wasn't following the rules, but his message was clear: he was willing to go to great lengths to fight for what was his. Green's smug expression faltered for just a second. He wasn't used to this. He was used to controlling the narrative, manipulating the facts, and playing the game. But Clint wasn't playing by the rules. Clint was rewriting the game entirely. "We'll take a brief recess," Judge Thompson announced, his voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Eastwood, I suggest you consult with your legal advisor before making any more statements. And Mr. Green, you'll have your chance to respond." Clint nodded and stood up, his mind racing. He didn't have the luxury of time. He had to win this battle, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that didn't always work in their favor. As the courtroom emptied for the recess, Clint stepped outside to clear his mind. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. It felt like another lifetime ago when he had stood on the dusty roads of Carmel, dreaming of a different life. But that life had never come. Instead, he had found himself here, facing a fight he wasn't sure he could win. But then again, Clint Eastwood had never been afraid of a challenge. And if there was one thing he knew, it was that the fight wasn't over until it was over. The recess had given Clint the brief moment of quiet he needed to gather his thoughts. Stepping back into the courtroom with a renewed sense of purpose, he could feel the weight of the case settle into his bones. But it wasn't just the case weighing on him, it was the fight within himself. For all his resolve, Clint had never been someone who sought out conflict. He had been trained to avoid it, to choose the path that was right rather than the path that was easy. But now, there was no avoiding it. The stakes were too high. The fight wasn't just about land. It wasn't even just about justice, it was about everything Clint had lost. Green was back in his seat, his eyes narrowed, waiting for the next round. The jury, too, had returned, and the atmosphere had shifted. What had started as a small case, with an old cowboy fighting against a large corporation, was now more than that. It had become a spectacle, a battle of ideologies, and both Clint and Green knew that this would only intensify from here on out. Clint sat back down, his eyes still focused on the opposing counsel. Green was a formidable opponent, and Clint would be lying if he said he wasn't a bit intimidated by the younger man's polished demeanor. But Clint had one advantage: he was fighting for something personal. Green had money and power, but Clint had something far stronger, a cause he believed in. And he intended to make sure everyone in that room knew it. Judge Thompson called the court back to order, and the tension in the room heightened as the proceedings resumed. Green wasted no time in taking the floor. His voice rang out, clear and precise as he laid out his counterarguments, using legal jargon and strategy that Clint was still getting used to. Mr. Eastwood's emotional appeal may tug at the heartstrings, but the facts are undeniable, Green began. Lender Enterprises has a legal right to this land, based on contracts and ownership deeds that predate Mr. Eastwood's family's claim. Legal rights are not swayed by personal narratives or dramatized appeals to sentiment. The law is clear. Clint knew what Green was trying to do. He was trying to undermine his credibility, trying to paint him as a man lost in his own emotions, as someone who didn't understand how the law worked. But Clint had something that Green didn't, an undeniable connection to the land. It wasn't just about paperwork or technicalities. It was about the blood and sweat that had gone into every inch of that property. It was about the years spent working the soil, the memories of his family's struggle, and the legacy he was determined to preserve. Clint stood, his voice steady and calm. "Your Honor, Mr. Green can talk all day about deeds and contracts, but the truth is, there's something that can't be written on a piece of paper. And that's history. My family has worked this land for generations. The fact that a corporation swooped in and claimed it doesn't change that. It's not about what's legally written, it's about what's right." The words hung in the air, the room falling into a hushed silence. The jury was watching, hanging on every word, and Clint felt the pressure of their gazes on him. He had to make them understand. He had to make them feel the truth. "This isn't just a piece of land," Clint continued, his voice rising with conviction. "It's a legacy. A piece of my family's history. You don't just take that away from people. Not without consequences." Green opened his mouth to speak, but Judge Thompson cut him off. "Mr. Green, you'll have your turn. Let Mr. Eastwood finish." Clint took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The room seemed to grow larger as he stood there, alone in his resolve. But Clint wasn't truly alone. He could hear Lisa's voice in his head, telling him to keep going, to hold fast to what he believed in. She had believed in him when no one else did, and he wouldn't let her down now. Not when it mattered most. "I'm not a lawyer," Clint said, his tone softer but no less firm. "But I know this land. I know what it means to my family. I'm here because I'm not willing to let go of something that's been in my family for generations. And if I lose, so be it. But I'll go down fighting." The room was still. For the first time, Clint felt like the jury was seeing him, not just as an actor or a man fighting for land, but as someone who truly understood the stakes. This wasn't a legal battle. This was a battle for his family's dignity. His legacy. Judge Thompson leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, and glanced at both Clint and Green. He hadn't shown much emotion throughout the trial, but Clint could sense that the judge was beginning to appreciate the weight of the case. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge said, his voice steady, "I'll remind you that personal sentiments don't always carry weight in a court of law. But I do understand your position. Now, Mr. Green, it's your turn." Green stood with a smile, a confident gleam in his eye. He had been preparing for this moment, waiting for Clint's emotional outburst. Now, it was time to turn the tide back in his favor. He walked to the front of the courtroom, holding a set of papers in his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Mr. Eastwood would have you believe that this is a matter of family heritage and personal sentiment. But the truth is, it's about legal ownership. Lender Enterprises holds all the necessary documents to prove their claim, and they have every right to this land." Clint sat back down, feeling the weight of Green's words press down on him. He could feel the tide turning, the pressure mounting. This wasn't just about legal documents anymore. This was about their ability to manipulate the system, to bend the law to their will. And Clint knew he had one chance left, one last move that could turn the whole case around. As Green continued to speak, Clint's mind raced. He knew what he had to do next. It wasn't enough to speak from the heart anymore. It was time to pull out all the stops. He was going to fight the only way he knew how, without fear, without hesitation. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. But Clint was ready. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a battlefield, and Clint Eastwood was no stranger to a fight. The days blurred into one another as the trial dragged on. Clint had never imagined how exhausting a legal battle could be. Every day, it felt as though he was running uphill, fighting against forces far stronger than him. Every motion he made, every word he spoke, seemed to chip away at him, but he had no intention of giving up. This wasn't just for him, it was for Lisa. It was for his children and the memory of his ancestors who had poured their sweat and soul into the land. But now, as the final days of the trial loomed, Clint could feel the weight of the case pressing down on him. It wasn't just the pressure of losing his family's land, it was the reality that his own fight might not be enough to win this. The legal world was a game he was ill-prepared for, and no matter how deeply he believed in the cause, it seemed like the odds were stacked against him. Green, too, seemed to sense the shift. His confidence had grown, and the smugness in his posture was now ever present. Every time Clint tried to speak, every time he made his case, Green shot him down with another legal precedent or a more persuasive argument. His strategy was to wear Clint down, to make him seem like a desperate man clinging to a dream that had already passed. Clint, however, hadn't been the one to give up easily in the past. And the more Green piled on his arguments, the more Clint realized how important it was to keep pushing back, to remind the court, and himself, that this fight was not about the legal system, but about something far more profound. The pivotal moment came late one afternoon. The courtroom was quieter than usual, and the exhaustion in the air was palpable. Clint had just finished another impassioned defense, talking once again about the history of his family, how his father had taught him to fight for what was right and how his mother had believed in the land's sacred connection to their ancestors. His words had struck a chord with a few of the jurors, but it was clear that the legal arguments had been swaying the rest. They were trapped in the web of contracts, clauses, and loopholes, unable to see the bigger picture. Clint had done everything he could to convince them of the land's significance beyond just ownership, he had laid his heart on the line. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Then came Green's final move. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Green began, standing tall in front of the court, "let's cut through the emotion for a moment and look at the facts. Mr. Eastwood's family has no claim to this land under the law. Lender Enterprises is the rightful owner. He speaks of legacy, but legacy alone does not give ownership." Clint sat, his fingers tightly gripping the arms of his chair. Green's voice was steady, his words calculated. The jury was listening intently. Clint's stomach twisted as he braced himself for the inevitable end to his battle. The fear of losing everything, of watching his family's legacy crumble, gripped him. And then, something inside Clint snapped. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was the unmistakable pull of hope, mixed with defiance. His mind flashed to Lisa, to the nights they had spent together, imagining a future where their children ran across the fields, where the land would always be in the family. He couldn't lose that. He wouldn't. Clint stood up slowly, his legs stiff, his heart pounding in his chest. The entire courtroom turned their gaze to him as he made his way to the center, his face set with determination. He didn't need legal jargon or fancy arguments. He only needed the truth. "Your Honor," Clint said, his voice calm but firm, "I've heard what Mr. Green has to say. And I know the law, too. But I'm not here to talk about contracts or deeds." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the jury. "I'm here because this land is my life. This is where I grew up. This is where I learned what it means to work hard, to sacrifice, to love. This land isn't just dirt, it's the place where my children learned to walk. It's where my wife and I spent our years building a life together. It's the place where my father taught me what it means to stand tall." The room was silent. Clint could feel his words landing, not just on the jury, but on everyone in the room. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere, a kind of reverence in the air. He took a deep breath and continued, his voice unwavering. "I understand the law. But I know in my heart, that some things can't be measured by contracts. Some things can't be weighed in the scales of justice. What's right, what's fair, is not about who holds a piece of paper. It's about what's been built with love, with sweat, and with the knowledge that this land means everything. Clint stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the jury. I don't have the resources to fight this the way Mr. Green can. I don't have the power or the money. But I have something that I know, deep down, no corporation or legal system can take from me. And that's the truth. This land belongs to my family, not because of what's written on a paper, but because of the love, the sacrifice, and the history we've built here. There was a long silence after Clint's words. The jury was still. Clint could feel the emotional weight of his speech settling over them, and he felt a surge of hope, an energy that told him, perhaps, this wasn't over after all. Green opened his mouth to argue, but Judge Thompson raised his hand, signaling for him to be silent. The judge looked at Clint with something resembling respect. He then turned to the jury, his face stern. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I believe we've heard all we need to hear. We will recess for the evening, and I will instruct you to begin deliberations tomorrow morning. As the courtroom emptied, Clint felt a strange sense of calm. His heart was still pounding, his nerves still frayed, but he had said what he needed to say. He had fought for what mattered. And that, in itself, felt like a victory. The emotional journey that had brought him to this point, of loss, love, and hope, had come full circle. He had bared his soul for all to see. Now, it was in the hands of the jury. Clint Eastwood wasn't sure what would happen next. But he knew this, no matter the outcome, he had given everything he had. And that, he thought, was the greatest victory of all. The waiting was unbearable. Clint couldn't sit still. Every tick of the clock on the wall seemed louder than the last, each second stretching on as if mocking his uncertainty. He had poured everything into his defense, and now it was out of his hands. The jury had gone to deliberate, and the weight of their decision was a heavy burden on his heart. He stood by the window, looking out over the town. The same town his father had once walked through, the town where his children had played in the streets. The land stretched out beyond the courthouse, the ranch that had been in his family for generations. He could almost see the silhouette of the barn in the distance, hear the sound of the cattle lowing, feel the dust beneath his boots. It was a part of him, a part of his soul. The thought of losing it was almost too much to bear. Lisa was sitting across the room, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't said much since they had left the courtroom. Clint knew she was nervous, too. He could see it in the tightness around her eyes. He had always been the strong one, the one who fought, but this time, he was afraid. Afraid of what losing would mean, of what it would do to their family. You did everything you could, Lisa said softly, breaking the silence. She stood up and walked over to him, her hand finding his. Her voice was gentle but firm, like the calm in the eye of a storm. You told them the truth. And that's all you could do. Now, we just have to wait. Clint turned his gaze back to her, taking comfort in the quiet strength she exuded. She was right, of course. He had done everything he could. He had spoken from the heart, made his case, fought for his family's legacy with everything he had. There was nothing more he could do. It was in the jury's hands now. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had worked for was on the edge of slipping away. Time dragged on until, finally, the door to the courtroom opened. The jury had returned. Clint felt his stomach tighten as he walked back to the courtroom, every step echoing in the hollow silence of the hallway. The air felt thick, heavy with the tension that had built up over the past few weeks. He stepped into the courtroom, Lisa at his side, and took his seat, his eyes fixed on the jury as they filed back in. Judge Thompson entered shortly after, and the room fell silent as he took his seat at the bench. He gave a nod to the foreman of the jury. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asked, his voice steady. The foreman, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a serious expression, stood up. We have, Your Honor. Clint's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't help but hold his breath, praying for a miracle. The foreman cleared his throat. In the case of Clint Eastwood versus Lender Enterprises, we, the jury, find in favor of Mr. Eastwood. The property in question shall remain in his family's possession. Clint's mind went blank for a moment. It was as if time had stopped. He could hear the voices in the room, some gasping, some murmuring, but none of it registered. He was still caught in the shock of the words that had just been spoken. Lisa's hand tightened around his, and Clint turned to her, seeing the tears welling up in her eyes. She smiled at him, her lips trembling. He could see the relief, the joy, and something else, the same strength she had always carried with her. The strength to believe in him when no one else did. The room erupted into quiet chatter, but Clint didn't hear any of it. He was still processing the fact that they had won. They had actually won. Judge Thompson spoke again, his voice breaking through Clint's dazed thoughts. This court is adjourned. The matter has been settled. Clint stood, his knees weak but his heart soaring. He turned to the jury, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. Thank you. Thank you for seeing the truth. The jurors nodded, some with approving smiles, others with a sense of solemnity. They had made the right decision, and Clint could feel it in their eyes. They had seen beyond the legalities, beyond the corporate interests, and had understood the importance of what he was fighting for. As Clint and Lisa walked out of the courtroom, the weight that had pressed so heavily on Clint's chest seemed to lift. The air outside was cool, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the town. Clint took a deep breath, feeling as if he were breathing in a new life, a new beginning. The battle had been won, but more importantly, something inside of him had changed. He wasn't just fighting for land anymore, he was fighting for the truth, for what was right. I can't believe it, Lisa said, her voice filled with awe. We did it. We really did it. Clint smiled, his heart still racing. We did. But it wasn't just me. It was all of us. We fought for it, together. As they walked back to the truck, Clint felt the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting. The long hours in court, the doubts, the fear, it had all led to this moment. It wasn't just the land they had won, it was the fight itself that mattered. The truth had prevailed. Clint's thoughts turned back to the ranch, to the land he loved. He knew there would be more battles to come. The corporate world didn't give up easily, and there would always be new challenges ahead. But for now, Clint had what mattered most. His family, his legacy, and his home. They climbed into the truck, and Clint started the engine, pulling away from the courthouse. As they drove toward the horizon, the golden light of the setting sun reflected off the windshield. Clint looked at Lisa, a smile tugging at his lips. What's next? Lisa asked, her voice full of hope. Clint chuckled softly, his gaze turning back to the road ahead. We rebuild. We protect what's ours. And we keep fighting, for each other. As they drove off into the fading light, Clint couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over him. The journey hadn't been easy. But in the end, it had been worth every second. The fight for justice, for what was right, had brought him to a place of reflection, of understanding. And he knew that, no matter what the future held, he would always stand strong, for his family, for the land, and for the truth. The days following the trial were a blur. Clint and Lisa had returned to the ranch, and while the victory over Lender Enterprises had been sweet, the reality of returning to life after such a battle was different than Clint had expected. There were still whispers in town, quiet murmurs of the courtroom drama and what it meant for the future of the land. Some congratulated him, others were skeptical, and a few still believed that a corporation like Lender Enterprises wouldn't let the issue go so easily. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was far from over. As much as he wanted to breathe easy, to relax and settle back into the rhythms of ranch life, He knew that corporations with the kind of power lender enterprises had wouldn't just accept defeat. It was only a matter of time before they came back. Clint sat at the kitchen table one afternoon, the sun streaming in through the window, casting a soft glow on the worn wood of the table. Lisa was in the other room, sorting through some old letters. The house was quiet, save for the soft murmur of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the house settling. The peace of the moment felt foreign after weeks of tension. But as Clint sipped his coffee, his mind kept wandering back to the trial. To the way Green had systematically picked apart his arguments, the cold, calculated manner in which he dismissed everything Clint believed in. Even now, Clint could feel the sting of being up against someone who wielded the law like a weapon, someone who could twist the rules to fit their own needs. The sound of footsteps behind him brought him out of his thoughts. Lisa appeared in the doorway, her expression thoughtful. She leaned against the frame, her arms crossed, and studied him for a moment before speaking. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" she asked, her voice quiet. Clint looked up at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Can't help it. I guess I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop." Lisa walked over to him and sat down. "I get it. But you can't live in fear forever, Clint. We've won this round. It's time to focus on rebuilding, not looking over your shoulder for the next fight." Clint met her eyes, his expression softening. She was right, of course. He had fought hard and won, and now it was time to focus on what mattered, his family, his land, and the future. But the nagging worry that lender enterprises would come back kept lingering in his mind. No one in town had heard anything from them since the verdict, but Clint knew better than to think it was over. "Do you think they'll come back?" Clint asked quietly. Lisa shook her head. "Maybe. But they've lost once. They won't want to risk another fight, not with everything they've got tied up in other cases." "You've made your point, Clint. You stood up to them, and you won. You have the law on your side now. And if they try anything again, we'll be ready." Clint nodded slowly. He knew she was right, but it didn't make the worry any easier to bear. Still, he couldn't dwell on it forever. He needed to focus on the here and now. The land was still his, and it was time to reclaim the sense of peace that had always been a part of this place. The following week, Clint and Lisa worked alongside the rest of the ranch hands to get the ranch back into shape. It had been a few months since the trial, and Clint had let too much time pass without truly tending to the land. He spent hours riding out into the fields, checking fences, making sure everything was running smoothly. The physical labor of the ranch felt good. It was familiar, grounding. And, for the first time in a while, Clint felt a sense of peace wash over him. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange, Clint stood at the edge of the property, looking out over the land. Lisa joined him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked softly. Clint thought for a moment. "All the time. But I used to think about it with fear. I used to wonder if we'd make it, if I'd lose everything. Now I think about it with hope." Lisa smiled, her eyes warm. "It's been a long road, but I think we're finally heading in the right direction." Clint nodded, the weight of the past few years still heavy in his chest, but the promise of the future beginning to take shape. "Yeah. I think we're finally going to be okay." But even as he spoke those words, Clint knew deep down that peace, like anything else, was temporary. There would always be challenges ahead. There would always be people who tried to take what didn't belong to them, who saw his family and his land as something to be exploited, something to be won and sold for a profit. But Clint also knew something else: he wasn't alone in this fight. He had Lisa by his side, his children growing up in the shadow of this legacy, and a community that, despite everything, still believed in him. And that was more than enough. Weeks passed, and just when Clint thought he could finally put the whole ordeal behind him, he received a letter. The envelope was thick, embossed with a corporate logo, Lender Enterprises. His stomach dropped as he stared at it. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The victory, so sweet just a short while ago, suddenly felt fragile. Lisa came into the room as Clint stared at the letter in his hands. She saw the look on his face and walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Is it them?" she asked. Clint nodded. "It's them." The letter felt like a weight in Clint's hands, and for a long moment, he couldn't bring himself to open it. The bold corporate logo of Lender Enterprises mocked him from the paper, a reminder that the battle was far from over. He could almost hear the cold, calculated voice of Green, the lawyer who had tried so hard to take everything Clint had worked for. It had been too quiet since the trial, too peaceful. Clint had allowed himself to think, perhaps naively, that they would back off after the crushing defeat. But now, with this letter in his hand, he knew better. Lisa stood beside him, her eyes focused on the letter. She hadn't said anything, but Clint could feel her tension, too. They both knew what this could mean. He took a deep breath and tore open the envelope, pulling out the heavy, legal-sized paper inside. As he read, the words became clearer, each sentence colder than the last. Lender Enterprises was not giving up. They were challenging the verdict. They had filed for an appeal, claiming that the jury had been swayed by emotional arguments rather than the law. They wanted another chance to seize the land. "Well, this is just perfect," Clint muttered, his voice laced with bitterness. He slammed the letter down on the kitchen table, his fists clenching. "They're not going to let it go. Not now. Not ever." Lisa sat down across from him, her face set with determination. "So, what are we going to do about it?" Clint's mind raced. The first trial had drained him, both physically and emotionally. Now, the prospect of doing it all over again felt like a cruel joke. He had given everything he had to that case. But what choice did he have? The ranch was his life, and he couldn't let it slip away. "We fight," Clint said, his voice steady but hard. "We fight again. This isn't over until I say it is." Lisa nodded, her lips tight. "And we'll fight smart. We learned a lot the first time. We'll be ready for whatever they throw at us." Clint let out a deep breath, trying to calm the anger that surged within him. He couldn't afford to let his emotions control him this time. He had to think clearly. The second trial would be tougher. They would be better prepared, more ruthless. But Clint had something on his side now that he hadn't had before, experience. And he wasn't going to let them take his land, his legacy, without one hell of a fight. The days that followed were filled with tension. Clint and Lisa consulted with their attorney, a seasoned litigator named Sam Caldwell, who had been part of their first trial. He had helped them get through the initial battle, and now they needed his expertise again. Sam was sharp, and he had a knack for understanding the intricacies of corporate law. But even he seemed apprehensive when Clint told him about the appeal. "Appealing a case is tough, Clint," Sam said, leaning back in his chair as they sat around his office table. "Lender Enterprises isn't going to take this lightly. They've got deep pockets, and they'll spare no expense in trying to take you down. But that doesn't mean you can't win. You've got the law on your side." Clint nodded. "I've been fighting for this ranch my whole life. I'll be damned if I let them take it now." Lisa sat beside Clint, her hand resting on his. She could feel his unease, but she refused to let him back down. They had already been through the worst, and now they had to keep pushing forward. "Is there anything we can do differently this time?" Lisa asked. Sam looked at her, thoughtful. "The key here is to prepare for what they'll focus on. This appeal will be based on the argument that the jury's decision was emotionally driven, not legally sound. We'll need to prove, once again, that this land is about more than just property, it's about your family, your legacy. But we'll also need to make sure we have every piece of evidence locked down. No stone can be left unturned." Clint gripped the arm of his chair, his jaw set. "We'll do whatever it takes." Sam gave a slow nod. Then let's get to work. Over the next few weeks, Clint and Lisa plunged themselves into the preparation for the second trial. It was grueling work. They had to revisit every aspect of their original case, comb through old documents, and find new evidence that could strengthen their position. They brought in experts to testify about the ranch's historical significance, the importance of the land to the local economy, and the environmental impact of selling it to a large corporation. They left no stone unturned. Every evening, Clint would return to the ranch after a long day of meetings, feeling the weight of the fight pressing down on him. He knew what was at stake. He knew the emotional toll it was taking on Lisa and the kids. But he refused to back down. The land had been in his family for generations, and he wasn't going to let some corporation take it from him. One evening, as Clint was returning from a particularly tense meeting with Sam, he found himself standing at the edge of the property, looking out over the fields. The land stretched out before him, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. It was peaceful here, in this quiet place, but there was a battle raging within him. A battle between fear and determination, between the weight of uncertainty and the unshakable belief that he could win. Lisa joined him, standing silently by his side. She didn't need to say anything. Clint could feel her support, her strength, in the way she stood next to him, shoulder to shoulder. Together, they were a team. "I won't lose it," Clint said, his voice quiet but resolute. "Not this time." Lisa squeezed his hand. "I know. And we won't lose it. Not as long as we're in this together." Clint turned to look at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't do this without you." "You don't have to," Lisa replied, her voice steady. "We're in this together, Clint. Always." They stood there for a long time, watching the sun sink below the horizon, the land stretched out before them, their future uncertain but filled with a quiet, fierce determination. The days leading up to the appeal trial felt like a strange mixture of urgency and stillness. Clint woke up each morning with a sense of purpose that had returned in full force, but there was something about the trial's looming date that felt different. He had fought hard for this land before, but this time was different. The stakes were higher. He wasn't just fighting for his ranch anymore, he was fighting for everything he had worked for, everything he had built with his own hands. Lisa could see the pressure building on Clint. He spent hours every day poring over documents, meeting with Sam, and preparing for the long, grueling trial ahead. The ranch, usually his refuge, had become a source of distraction. His focus was split between the land and the case, and it was beginning to take its toll on him. One evening, after another long day of preparing, Clint and Lisa sat down to dinner. It was a quiet affair, both of them tired, the air thick with unspoken words. Clint absent-mindedly pushed his food around his plate, his mind elsewhere. Lisa noticed his distant look. "You haven't been yourself lately," she said softly, breaking the silence. "You've been so focused on the case that I'm afraid you're losing sight of what really matters." Clint looked up, meeting her eyes, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He had been so caught up in the fight that he had neglected the things that gave his life meaning. The ranch. His family. His peace of mind. He hadn't even realized how much the stress was eating away at him until Lisa had pointed it out. "I know," Clint admitted, rubbing his forehead. "I'm just so scared, Lisa. Scared that this might be the last time I get to hold on to this place. And I don't know how to handle it." Lisa's eyes softened, and she reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I know you're scared. I am too. But we can't let fear control us, Clint. We have to remember why we're doing this in the first place. It's not just about winning the case. It's about protecting everything we've built. And we've already fought so hard. You've already fought so hard." Clint sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're right. It's just hard. The last time felt like a victory, but this time, I don't know what to expect. They'll be ready for us. And I don't know if we're prepared enough. You are, Lisa said firmly. You've got Sam, you've got the experts, and most importantly, you've got your heart. You've always known what's right. That's your strength. Clint let out a slow breath, grateful for her unwavering support. Thanks, Lisa. I don't know what I'd do without you. They sat in silence for a while, just holding hands, letting the weight of the conversation settle between them. Clint felt a sense of relief wash over him, a reminder that, despite everything, he wasn't alone in this fight. Lisa had been his rock through all of this. And whatever happened, they would face it together. The day of the appeal trial finally arrived, and Clint found himself sitting in the courtroom once again, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Davis, sat at the bench, her expression unreadable. The opposing counsel, a younger lawyer named Rachel Grant, was already seated, reviewing her notes. Clint recognized her as one of the top lawyers Lender Enterprises had. If anything, this trial was going to be even tougher than the first. Lisa sat beside Clint, her hand lightly resting on his. She squeezed his hand, a silent reminder that they were in this together. Let's go over everything one last time, Sam whispered, leaning in from his seat next to them. Remember, they'll try to twist everything we say. Don't let them rattle you. Stick to the facts. Stick to the truth. Clint nodded, his jaw set with determination. He was ready. They were ready. As the proceedings began, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Rachel Grant was the first to speak, her voice smooth and confident as she laid out her argument. She wasted no time in claiming that the original trial had been a miscarriage of justice, that the jury had been swayed by the emotional appeal of Clint's testimony and the romanticized notion of family heritage. According to her, the law was clear, the land was not a personal treasure but a commodity to be bought and sold. Clint could feel his blood pressure rising as he listened to her arguments. It was exactly what he had feared. They were going to attack his motivations, his emotions, and the deep personal connection he had with the land. But Clint wasn't going to let them get away with it. He was ready to fight back, harder than ever. When it was Clint's turn to speak, he stood up slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, remembering everything that was at stake. As he began to speak, his voice was steady, but the passion behind his words was unmistakable. This land is not just dirt and trees. It's my family's history. It's our legacy. You can't just take it because it doesn't make sense on a balance sheet, Clint said, his voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. I've worked this land my whole life. I've put blood, sweat, and tears into it. And I will continue to fight for it, because it's more than just land to me. It's who I am. The room was silent as Clint finished speaking. Even Judge Davis, who had remained stoic throughout the trial, seemed to take a moment to process Clint's words. It was a long, hard fight, but Clint had delivered his truth, and that was all he could do. He had given everything. As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom didn't ease. Rachel Grant's arguments were sharp, trying to tear apart Clint's personal connections to the land. But Clint stood firm, answering each of her questions with the same resolve he had shown throughout the trial. He knew this was his last chance to keep the land, and he wasn't going to back down. By the end of the day, as the courtroom began to empty, Clint and Lisa walked out together, their heads held high. It had been a brutal day, but Clint could feel the weight of his words lingering in the air. They had fought hard, and he had given everything he had. Now, all they could do was wait. The days after the second trial felt like a slow, suffocating crawl. Clint had hoped that by now, the stress would have lifted, that the uncertainty of the case would fade into the background. But the opposite was true. Every moment felt heavy with anticipation. The verdict wasn't expected for weeks, but the weight of that uncertainty gnawed at him. Every time the phone rang, his heart skipped a beat. Every time someone knocked at the door, his pulse quickened. It was impossible to relax, knowing that his entire future, his legacy, his home, the land that had been in his family for generations, was hanging in the balance. At night, when Clint lay in bed beside Lisa, he found himself staring at the ceiling, wide awake. The shadows of the room seemed to mock him, a reminder that everything could be taken away in an instant. He had been through so much already, but this, the waiting, the unknown, felt like it might break him. Lisa could sense his restlessness. She would reach for his hand in the dark, squeezing it gently. "We've done everything we can, Clint. Now we just have to wait." Clint sighed, but he didn't respond. What could he say? The truth was, waiting was the hardest part. He had fought for everything he believed in, but there was nothing more he could do. All they could do now was trust that the jury, the judge, and the law would see things the way they had. But doubt lingered. The mornings were the worst. Clint would wake up early, long before the sun rose, and make his way to the kitchen. There, he would stand by the window, staring out at the land, his land, and he'd feel the weight of it settle on him. There were moments, brief flashes of clarity, when he could almost convince himself that it was all going to be fine. But those moments were fleeting, and soon the doubt would creep back in. Lisa, ever the steady presence, would join him soon after. She was always up before the others, always the first to meet the day with purpose. She would offer him a quiet smile as she made coffee, and Clint would feel a small surge of gratitude. He didn't know what he would have done without her. "Another long day ahead," Clint would say, his voice low and tired. One day closer to the end, Lisa would reply, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. Clint would nod, but his mind would wander, taking him back to the courtroom. The way Rachel Grant had tried to tear apart everything he believed in. The way she had used every technicality to undermine his connection to the land. He could still hear her voice in his head, cold and dismissive, as if the land meant nothing more than a few acres of earth, something to be sold off to the highest bidder. Clint had tried to remain calm during the trial, to stick to the facts, but Rachel's tactics had pushed every button. Every time she insinuated that his fight was just emotional, just a desperate attachment to something that wasn't worth the price tag, he had felt a fire ignite within him. But he had held it together, focusing on the one thing he knew: the land was more than just land to him. It was his legacy. And no one could take that from him. Weeks passed, and with each one, Clint's anxiety grew. Lisa kept him grounded, urging him to take breaks, to step away from the case every now and then. But it was hard for Clint to let go, even for a moment. Every time he walked through the fields, he found himself scanning the horizon, imagining what might be waiting for him beyond the fence. He had been fighting this battle for so long, and the idea of it being over, one way or the other, was overwhelming. One afternoon, Sam called. Clint had been expecting the call. The time for the verdict was drawing near. Sam's voice was calm but firm on the other end of the line. "Clint, we should prepare ourselves," Sam said. "I know this is hard, but I need you to be ready for whatever the judge decides." Clint clenched his jaw. "I'm ready. I don't want to hear any more about preparing for the worst. I've already fought the worst." Sam hesitated for a moment, then spoke again, quieter this time. "I know. I just want you to be ready, no matter what happens." Clint could hear the seriousness in Sam's voice, but it didn't change how Clint felt. He had given everything in that courtroom, and he wasn't going to let this slip away. Not now. Not after all they had been through. "I'll be ready," Clint replied, the words as much for himself as they were for Sam. The next few days felt like they were dragging on, the silence stretching between each phone call and each day that passed. Clint found himself jumping at every knock on the door, every ring of the phone. It was as if the world had held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, one evening, the phone rang just as Clint was about to head out to the barn. He rushed to answer it, his heart pounding in his chest. "Clint," Sam's voice came through the line, steady but somehow urgent. "The verdict's in. The judge is ready to announce her decision tomorrow. Clint's stomach flipped. The moment he had been dreading had finally arrived. His future was about to be decided, and there was no going back. "Thanks, Sam," Clint said, his voice tight. Lisa entered the room just as Clint hung up the phone. She could see the storm in his eyes, the weight of the news settling in. "It's tomorrow," Clint said quietly. "The verdict." Lisa didn't say anything at first. She simply walked over to Clint, standing beside him. Her hand found his, and together, they stood in silence, waiting for what was about to come. Tomorrow. It would all come down to tomorrow. That night, sleep was impossible for Clint. His mind raced, thoughts colliding with one another, and he could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. The ranch. His family. His life. Everything he had worked for. Everything he had fought for. It could all change in an instant. As he lay beside Lisa, he could feel her steady presence next to him, but even that comfort couldn't calm the storm in his mind. All he could do was wait. And hope. And prepare for whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The morning of the verdict arrived with an unnerving stillness. Clint woke up before dawn, as he always did. The first rays of light were barely breaking through the window when he stood, pulling on his boots, the sound of them hitting the floor like a drumbeat echoing in the stillness of the house. The house, usually so full of life and energy, felt unusually quiet today. Lisa was still asleep, her breath slow and steady, her face serene. But Clint knew that today was not going to be easy for either of them. He stepped outside and walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on the gravel. The morning air was crisp, the sky just starting to turn a pale shade of blue. Clint paused for a moment, looking out over the land. The field stretched out before him, vast and untouched. Everything about this land spoke of history, his history. The legacy of his father, his grandfather, and countless generations before them. He had fought hard to preserve it, but now the outcome was out of his hands. Clint knew that once the verdict was handed down, there was no going back. If the decision didn't go in his favor, he would lose everything. Not just the land, but a part of himself. He couldn't imagine life without it. It wasn't just soil beneath his boots, it was the very fabric of his identity. The thought of it slipping away was a torment he couldn't fully grasp. But he wasn't alone. Not today. He felt the presence of his family behind him, even if they weren't physically there yet. Lisa, his pillar of strength, would stand by him no matter the outcome. Sam, the unflinching lawyer who had never wavered. His community, his friends. They were all waiting with him, too. Clint had to remind himself that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about all of them, about the legacy they all shared, and about what was at stake for the future of this ranch. As Clint and Lisa drove into town later that morning, the streets felt emptier than usual. People went about their business with their heads down, avoiding eye contact as though they could feel the weight of the moment in the air. It seemed as if everyone in town knew about the case, even if they didn't know all the details. The ranchers, the local shopkeepers, the townsfolk, they all knew that if Clint lost, it would be a blow to the entire community. When they arrived at the courthouse, the atmosphere was heavy. The steps leading up to the entrance felt like a path to judgment, and Clint's heart pounded in his chest as they climbed them. Lisa's hand was warm in his, her grip steady, but even she couldn't completely hide the tension in her eyes. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet chatter as people took their seats. The judge's bench loomed ahead, and Clint could see Sam talking to a few key figures in the case, witnesses, legal advisors, and supporters. But all Clint could focus on was the chair in front of him, where he would sit and wait for the decision. His heart raced as the clock ticked closer to the moment when everything would change. The judge, Judge Davis, entered the room, and the murmurs of the courtroom ceased immediately. She was a woman of few words, but her presence commanded respect. As she sat at her bench, her expression unreadable, Clint could feel the silence tighten around them like a vice. The decision was coming. "All rise," the court clerk announced, and everyone stood as Judge Davis prepared to speak. Clint's stomach twisted into knots. His mind flashed back to the earlier days, the trial, the struggle, the sleepless nights. Everything had led to this one moment. His fate. The future of the ranch. His entire life hung in the balance. "Please be seated," Judge Davis said, her voice cool and composed. Clint felt the tension in the room as if it were a physical thing. He glanced at Lisa, who sat beside him, her eyes calm but filled with an anxiety that matched his own. She squeezed his hand, offering a small smile, and Clint tried to return it, though the weight of the moment kept his lips tight. Judge Davis cleared her throat. "After careful consideration of all the evidence presented during this appeal, the court has reached a decision." She paused, her eyes sweeping over the room, as though making sure everyone was listening. Clint's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. "In accordance with the law and the evidence, I find in favor of the plaintiff, Clint Eastwood." Clint's heart stopped for a brief moment. His body went rigid, and for a moment, it felt as though time had frozen. He blinked hard, trying to process the words, trying to make sure he had heard them correctly. "In favor of me?" Clint whispered, not fully able to believe it. His voice was barely audible, but Lisa heard him and turned to look at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Yes," she whispered back, her hand gripping his tighter now. The courtroom erupted into a quiet murmur of disbelief and relief. The decision had been reached. Clint had won. But even as the reality of the verdict started to settle in, Clint remained still. He couldn't quite grasp it. The tension that had been building for so long, the anxiety and the waiting, it was all gone in an instant. And yet, it didn't feel like a victory. Not in the way he had imagined. It felt like the first step of a long road, not the end of a battle. Judge Davis banged her gavel. "This case is adjourned. Mr. Eastwood, the land remains in your possession." Clint could hardly process the words. His head was spinning. He turned to Lisa, his eyes wide, and she was smiling, tears filling her eyes as she held him tightly. "We did it," she said, her voice choked with emotion. Clint nodded, but there was no joy in his face. Not yet. It wasn't relief that he felt. It was just the exhaustion of a fight that had been too long. The battle was over, but the war, in some ways, was only beginning. The walk back to the car was a blur. People congratulated Clint, slapping him on the back and offering handshakes, but he could hardly hear them. He felt numb, detached. His mind was already working ahead, thinking about what this victory would mean for the future, for the ranch, and for the family he had promised to protect. Lisa could sense the distance. As they climbed into the truck, she reached out and gently touched his arm. "You did it, Clint," she said softly. "You kept your promise." He nodded slowly, but his gaze was distant, focused on the road ahead. There was so much to think about, so much still left to be done. The victory wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Clint had saved the land, but he knew the real work was only just starting. The days following the verdict were a strange mixture of relief and tension. Clint had won. The ranch, his home, and everything he had fought for were safe. Yet, something lingered in his chest, a quiet sense of uncertainty. The legal battle had taken its toll on him, and despite the success, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The morning after the verdict, Clint woke up to the sounds of birds chirping outside and the faint hum of the wind through the trees. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow across the land he had worked so hard to protect. Lisa was already up, moving quietly around the kitchen, making coffee as she always did. Clint lingered at the doorframe, taking in the sight of her. She had always been his rock, his constant support through the ups and downs of life. He'd never taken her for granted, but in the aftermath of the trial, he was more aware than ever of how much she meant to him. She had been his pillar, the one who held him steady when the weight of the world seemed too heavy to carry. "Morning," Clint said, stepping into the kitchen. Lisa looked up with a soft smile, her eyes bright and warm. "Morning," she replied, pouring him a cup of coffee. "How are you feeling?" Clint took the coffee with a grateful nod but didn't answer right away. He stared out the window, watching the land stretch out before him. The same land that had been at the heart of everything. The land that he had nearly lost. "I'm not sure," he said finally. "It's strange, you know. After everything, it doesn't feel like a win. It just feels like we've bought ourselves some time." Lisa was quiet for a moment, and then she stepped closer to him, placing her hand gently on his arm. "Maybe. But you've won, Clint. You fought for this land, and now it's yours. It's more than just time, it's your future. Our future." Clint's eyes wandered back to her, and he gave her a small smile. He didn't say anything, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of the hope that had been so elusive in the last few months. The coffee was strong, but Clint drank it slowly, savoring the warmth of it as he tried to process the overwhelming emotions inside him. The victory had been hard-earned, but it still didn't feel real. Maybe because there was still so much at stake. They'd fought against a system that seemed intent on stripping them of everything they held dear, but the fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done. The following week, Clint found himself back in town, meeting with Sam and a few other key figures. The trial was over, but there were still the legalities to sort out, the fine print of the decision that had to be ironed out before the final word could be said. Clint was prepared for it, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of exhaustion creeping into his bones. The pressure of the trial had drained him more than he realized. Sam, as always, was calm and collected. But there was something different in his demeanor this time, something that Clint couldn't quite place. "How's everything going, Clint?" Sam asked as they sat in the back office of the small law firm. Clint was staring at the stack of papers on the desk, knowing that this was just another part of the journey. The legal battle had been grueling, and even though the judge had ruled in their favor, there was still paperwork, appeals, and technicalities to address. Clint sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It feels like there's always something more. It's never really over, is it?" Sam looked at him thoughtfully. "No, it's never really over. But you've won. That's what matters. You got through the worst part." Clint nodded, but the doubt still lingered. "The land is safe. For now. But what about next time? What happens if they come after it again?" Sam leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "We'll cross that bridge when we get there. You've made it clear that this land means everything to you. And we'll fight again if we have to. But let's not borrow trouble. For now, let's focus on getting the paperwork wrapped up, and then you can finally breathe." Clint rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of Sam's words. The victory hadn't brought the peace he'd expected. Instead, it had opened up a new set of challenges. There was still a long road ahead, and Clint wasn't sure if he was ready for it. But he knew he couldn't back down now. He couldn't afford to. Back at the ranch, Clint spent his days tending to the land, making sure everything was in order. The tractors hummed as they plowed the fields, the animals were fed and cared for, and the fences were checked. But even as he worked, Clint's mind kept wandering back to the court case. To the future. To the uncertainty. Lisa noticed the shift in him. She could tell that something was off, even though he tried to hide it. He had been quieter, more distant. The physical labor kept him busy, but it didn't seem to soothe him the way it once had. "Clint," she said one evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset. Talk to me. You're not the same. You won. Clint looked out at the horizon, the colors of the setting sun casting long shadows across the land. I know, he said, his voice low. But I'm still not sure it's enough. What if it all falls apart? What if someone else comes after it? I can't let that happen, Lisa. I can't lose it again. She sat beside him, her arm around his shoulders, and for a long time, neither of them said anything. They just sat there in the quiet, listening to the sounds of the night settling around them. You're not alone in this, Lisa finally said. We'll figure it out. Together. You've already proven that you'll do whatever it takes to keep this place. And that's enough for me. Clint turned to look at her, her face soft in the fading light, and he felt something shift inside him. The fear, the doubt, the exhaustion, it was still there. But Lisa's words, her unwavering support, reminded him of why he had fought in the first place. He smiled faintly, leaning into her touch. I don't know what I'd do without you. I'll be here. Always, she said simply. And for the first time in weeks, Clint allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. The days that followed Clint's legal victory were quieter, but they were far from peaceful. The ranch, which had once been a place of refuge and purpose, now felt like a battleground in a different sense. Clint had won the fight in the courtroom, but the scars of the battle, the weight of it all, lingered. It wasn't just the legal challenges he'd faced, there were also the whispers of the past. Whispers about his father. About the choices Clint had made as a young man. Those voices had been silent for years, but now, with the land saved and the victory in his hands, they began to rise again, creeping in the shadows. The ranch was far from just a plot of land to Clint. It was his legacy, his birthright. But it was also his father's legacy. A father who had been a hard man, a man who had made difficult choices and paid the price for them. The history of the land was intertwined with Clint's own history, and sometimes, that history wasn't so simple. It was a cool afternoon when Clint decided to take a walk to the old barn where he and his father had worked together in his younger years. The place was empty now, silent except for the sound of the wind and the occasional creak of the weathered wood. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the smell of hay and dust. Clint had spent countless hours here with his father, learning the ways of the land, how to work the fields, how to raise cattle. His father had been tough, demanding, but Clint had always known that it was out of love. Out of a desire to make him strong, to make him ready to carry on the legacy. But that legacy had been a burden. One Clint hadn't fully realized until much later. He had spent years running from it, trying to find his own way. He'd moved to the city for a time, far from the ranch and its memories. But the call of the land had always been there, pulling him back. His father had made sure that Clint understood the weight of what it meant to own this place. He had taught him the value of hard work, but also the cost of that work. Standing there now, Clint couldn't help but feel the weight of those lessons once again. He had tried so hard to forge his own identity, to make his own choices. But in the end, it seemed that no matter what he did, he was always going to be tied to this land. To the past. You're thinking about him again, aren't you? A voice suddenly broke through Clint's thoughts. Clint turned to see Sam standing at the edge of the barn, his hands in his pockets. Sam was always around, always in the background when Clint needed him. Clint nodded slowly. Yeah, he said, his voice a little more hoarse than he had intended. I can't help it. It's like I've been fighting my whole life to prove that I'm not him. But it doesn't feel like I've ever escaped his shadow. Not really. Sam took a few steps closer, his boots scraping on the gravel. Your father was a hard man. But you're not him, Clint. You're your own man. You made it through this fight, didn't you? And you did it your way. Not his. Clint wasn't sure if he believed that. How could he, when everything he had fought for was tied to his father's legacy? It was like every choice he made, every step forward, came with the knowledge that he had inherited something he wasn't sure he wanted. "You've done more than most would have," Sam continued. "I don't think your father would have expected anything less from you. But that doesn't mean you have to carry his weight anymore." Clint stood in the doorway of the barn for a moment longer, then turned to face Sam. "I don't know if I can leave it all behind. The ranch, the land, everything, it's too much of who I am, who I was. If I lose that, I lose myself." "You've already won, Clint. You've already proved that you're not bound by the past. The future is what you make it," Sam said, his voice firm but understanding. Clint nodded, but he didn't feel reassured. The past had a way of pulling him back, no matter how hard he tried to leave it behind. Later that evening, Clint found himself back at the house, sitting in the dim light of the kitchen. Lisa was working on dinner, humming softly to herself as she chopped vegetables. Clint watched her for a long time, taking in the rhythm of her movements, the way she moved with such grace and ease. It was one of the things he loved most about her, her ability to bring calm to his turbulent thoughts. She paused for a moment and glanced over at him, sensing the heaviness in the air. "You're quiet tonight," she said, setting down the knife. Clint hesitated. He had never been good at talking about the things that troubled him. The things that gnawed at him deep inside. But Lisa could always see through him. "It's the ranch," Clint said after a long pause. "I keep thinking about my father. About everything he wanted me to be. Everything he expected." Lisa walked over to him and sat down beside him at the table, taking his hand. "Clint," she said softly, "you don't have to be your father. You've already shown the world that you're your own man. What you've built here, what you've fought for, it's all you. Not him." Clint sighed, but there was something about the way she said it, the steadiness in her voice, that made him feel like he could believe her. Maybe she was right. Maybe it wasn't about living up to his father's expectations. Maybe it was about building something of his own. "I just wish I could shake this feeling," Clint murmured. "That everything I do is tied to his choices. That I'm not really free." Lisa squeezed his hand gently, her eyes full of understanding. "You are free, Clint. But freedom doesn't come without its struggles. The hardest battles are the ones we fight with ourselves. But you're not alone. You have me, you have Sam, and you have this land. Whatever happens, you're not fighting this alone." Clint looked at her, his heart heavy with gratitude. She was right. It had always been about the fight. And maybe, just maybe, this time, he was fighting for the right reasons. "Thank you," Clint said quietly, his voice full of emotion. Lisa smiled softly. "Always." As Clint leaned back in his chair, he realized that he might never fully escape the shadow of his past. But he didn't need to. He had made his peace with it. And with Lisa by his side, maybe the future wouldn't feel so uncertain after all. As the days passed, the ranch slowly began to feel like home again. Clint had settled into a routine, the familiar rhythm of early mornings and long days in the fields. The weight of the legal battle had begun to fade, but there was something else in the air now, something subtle, like the calm before a storm. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that the peace he'd fought so hard to preserve was fragile, like a thread ready to snap. Lisa had noticed it too. She'd been watching him closely, seeing how he had begun to withdraw, how his thoughts seemed always a step ahead, as though he were waiting for something. Something he wasn't ready for. "Clint," she said one evening, sitting beside him on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land. "You've been on edge for days. What's going on?" Clint let out a long breath and turned his gaze toward the endless stretch of the ranch. The wind was picking up, carrying with it the scent of earth and grass. But it wasn't the familiar scent of home that Clint smelled, it was the scent of something else. Something that felt far too close. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I thought after the trial, after everything, I'd feel relieved. But I can't shake this feeling. It's like something is coming, and I don't know what it is. Lisa looked at him, her brow furrowed with concern. What do you mean? Is it about the ranch? The land? Clint shook his head slowly. No, it's not that. I mean, yeah, there's still work to do. But I'm not worried about that. It's something else. I feel like we're not out of the woods yet. I'm waiting for something I can't even name. The wind picked up, rustling the trees and sending a chill through the air. Lisa wrapped her arms around herself, but she didn't pull away from Clint. Instead, she leaned her head against his shoulder, offering him the quiet support that he so often needed. Do you think it's because of your father? She asked gently. Because of everything you've been carrying? Clint closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the question. He had spent years trying to escape the shadow of his father's expectations, but maybe Lisa was right. Maybe that shadow still hung over him, even in the quiet moments. Even now, with the land saved and the battle won. Maybe, Clint said softly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Maybe it's just. I don't know how to let go of the past, Lisa. I thought I could. But it's still here. And it feels like it's going to catch up with me. Lisa's voice was steady, unwavering. You don't have to carry it alone, Clint. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. You don't have to fight this fight by yourself. Clint looked down at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. It was in moments like this, when the world felt too big and too overwhelming, that he realized how much Lisa truly meant to him. She had always been there, offering him a sense of calm, a sense of belonging. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to get him through whatever came next. I'm scared, Lisa, Clint admitted, the words coming out more raw than he had intended. I'm scared that I'll lose everything again. That everything I've fought for will slip through my fingers. Lisa turned to face him, her eyes full of empathy. I know. But no matter what happens, we'll face it together. We'll find a way through. Clint nodded, the quiet strength in her words settling something deep inside him. He didn't know what was coming, but maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone in this fight as he thought. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Clint kept himself busy, trying to push away the unease that had settled in his chest. The ranch needed work, and he threw himself into it with his usual focus. But the feeling of impending danger was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. It wasn't until one rainy afternoon, as Clint was out in the barn checking the cattle, that the storm finally arrived. Sam had come by to help with the fencing, but he looked different today, his face pale, his eyes strained. Clint noticed it immediately when Sam walked into the barn, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something that made Clint's gut tighten. Sam, what's going on? Clint asked, his voice sharp with concern. Sam hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking toward the barn door as if he was waiting for someone to appear. He looked back at Clint, and the gravity in his voice made Clint's stomach drop. It's the land, Clint, Sam said slowly. There's been talk. Someone is trying to challenge the decision. They're not giving up. They want it. They're willing to do whatever it takes to take this place from you. Clint's heart skipped a beat. He had known that his victory in court hadn't meant the end of the fight. But this was more than he had expected. Who? Clint demanded, stepping closer, his jaw clenched tight. Who's behind this? Sam looked away, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the barn. I don't know yet. But they've got money, Clint. They've got influence. And they won't stop until they get what they want. Clint's mind raced, his thoughts whirling. Everything he had fought for was being threatened again. His land. His future. His peace. Then we fight again, Clint said, his voice cold and determined. We don't let them take it from us. Not again. Sam nodded slowly, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. It won't be easy, Clint. These people, they don't fight fair. You need to be ready for whatever comes next. Clint squared his shoulders, his resolve hardening. I'm ready. Later that evening, Clint sat alone in the study, the weight of the news hanging heavy on his shoulders. The ranch was under threat again, and he wasn't sure how much more of this he could take. The legal battle had already drained him, but the idea of going through it all again, of facing down enemies who wouldn't hesitate to tear everything he had worked for apart, was almost too much to bear. But he knew one thing, he wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. He had fought for this land once. And he would fight for it again. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and late nights spent researching legal loopholes. Clint had hoped that the victory in the courtroom would provide some semblance of peace, but instead, it had only ignited a new fire. The reality of defending his ranch again was more daunting than he had ever imagined. The opponent this time wasn't just a faceless corporation or some unknown adversary, it was personal. It was about power, about money, and about a deep-seated desire to take everything Clint had worked for. Sam had warned him, but now Clint was beginning to feel the full weight of that warning. The shadow of his past had only been the beginning. The storm that was coming was something far more dangerous, and Clint was going to have to face it head-on. But even in his determination, there was a part of him that hesitated, doubt nagging at the edges of his mind, making him wonder if this battle was one he could truly win. It was late one evening when Clint found himself once again sitting alone in the study. The flickering light from the fireplace cast long shadows across the walls. Lisa had gone to bed hours ago, and the house was quiet, save for the occasional crackling of the fire. Clint had always found solace in the solitude, but tonight it felt like a suffocating weight. His phone rang, snapping him from his thoughts. He looked at the screen, it was an unknown number. Without hesitation, he answered. Clint Eastwood, he said, his voice firm. Mr. Eastwood, came the voice on the other end, low and smooth, with an accent Clint couldn't quite place. I understand you've been receiving disturbing news. Clint stiffened, his gut tightening. Who is this? A concerned party, the voice replied. Someone who thinks you should know that your troubles are far from over. Clint's mind raced. He had dealt with threats before, but this felt different. The voice was calm, almost too calm. What do you want? We simply want to make sure you understand the stakes, the voice said, a faint chuckle in the background. The land you so desperately cling to, well, let's just say it's not going to remain in your hands for long. You've made a lot of enemies, Mr. Eastwood. And they don't forget easily. Clint's heart raced, but he kept his voice steady. I've been through a lot to keep this land. I won't give it up without a fight. The voice on the other end chuckled again, but this time, there was an edge to it. We'll see how long your fight lasts, Mr. Eastwood. You might want to think carefully about how far you're willing to go. People like you, they don't always win in the end. The line went dead, and Clint was left holding the phone, his mind racing with the implications of the call. It was a threat, plain and simple. And the person on the other end wasn't bluffing. The next morning, Clint met Sam at the barn, his mind still reeling from the cryptic conversation. Sam had been worried ever since Clint had told him about the phone call, but Clint hadn't wanted to drag him into the depths of the storm just yet. However, the time for silence had passed. They needed to act, and they needed to act fast. Clint, what's going on? Sam asked, his voice low as they walked toward the stables. Clint rubbed a hand across his face. That was a warning. Someone's out to take the ranch. I don't know who they are yet, but they're playing for keeps. Sam frowned, his expression hardening. We knew this wasn't over. But I didn't think they'd come at you like this. They're not just coming at me, Clint said, his voice sharp. They're coming for everything I've worked for. Everything my father worked for. And I won't let them take it without a fight. Sam nodded slowly. What do we do next? Clint glanced out over the land, his mind working through the possibilities. We need to dig deeper. Find out who's behind this. We can't let them get away with this, Sam. We've got your back, Clint, Sam said, his voice steady, as always. We'll find out who they are, and we'll stop them. Whatever it takes. Clint didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared out at the land, his thoughts swirling. It wasn't just about saving the ranch anymore. It was about proving to himself, to everyone, that he was willing to fight for what he believed in. That the ranch, and everything it represented, mattered more than anything. But as the days wore on, the reality of the situation began to set in. Clint was facing forces far more powerful than he had ever imagined. He had dealt with the land, with the law, and with his own demons, but this was something else entirely. He spent hours going through old legal documents, trying to find any way to use the system against his opponents. Lisa, ever supportive, helped him as much as she could, but the pressure was starting to wear on both of them. There were moments when Clint could see the strain in her eyes, the worry that had started to creep in. He had promised her that he would keep them safe, that he would never let anything tear their lives apart again. But that promise was feeling increasingly impossible to keep. One afternoon, as Clint and Sam were poring over the documents, a car pulled up to the gate. Clint stood up quickly, his senses immediately on high alert. He looked out the window, trying to make out the shape of the vehicle. "Who's that?" Sam asked, squinting out the window. Clint didn't recognize the car, and the feeling in his gut only grew stronger. Without waiting for Sam, he grabbed his jacket and walked toward the front door. The visitor was already getting out of the car when Clint stepped outside. A tall man, well-dressed, with sharp features and a cold, calculating look in his eyes. Clint had seen that look before, on the faces of people who didn't care about the land, who only cared about what it could give them. "Can I help you?" Clint asked, his voice hard. The man offered a thin smile. "I'm John Bennett. I've heard a lot about you, Clint. It's a pleasure to finally meet the man who's been causing so much trouble around here." Clint's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. "I don't know who you are, but I'm not interested in any trouble." Bennett's smile never wavered, but there was something dangerous in it. "Oh, you'll be interested soon enough. The question is, how much are you willing to lose to keep this place? We both know it's not just about the land anymore. It's about who has control." Clint's blood ran cold. He had been right. The storm had finally arrived, and it was far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Clint stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes locked on John Bennett. The man's presence was almost too polished, too perfect, like someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of intimidation. His tailored suit and perfectly combed hair didn't fit in with the rugged, weathered landscape of Clint's ranch, and yet, somehow, he seemed to belong here. Or at least, he thought he did. Clint's mind raced. This was the person who had come to collect, someone with power, someone who saw Clint's fight as nothing more than a business deal, a transaction. "You're trespassing," Clint said coldly, the words sharp as daggers. "If you're here to try and take my land, you'd better turn around and leave. Now." Bennett didn't flinch. In fact, he smiled, a slow, calculating grin that sent a chill down Clint's spine. "I'm not here to steal your land, Clint. I'm here to make a deal." Clint's grip tightened on the doorframe. "I don't make deals with people like you." Bennett's gaze flicked over Clint's shoulder, past the old wood and the creaking fence posts, to the vast stretch of ranch land beyond. "I don't think you understand the position you're in. This isn't just about land anymore. It's about legacy. Control. Power. And I think you'll find that power is something you don't have as much of as you might believe." Clint's heart hammered in his chest. He could feel the pressure mounting. Everything about this conversation was a warning. Bennett was testing him, poking at the foundations of Clint's world to see where it would crack. And Clint wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of showing weakness. "I'm not interested in your games," Clint replied, his voice tight. Whatever you're offering, I'm not buying. Bennett took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Clint's. Let's be clear, Clint. You don't have a choice. If you want to keep the ranch, if you want to keep everything you've fought for, you'll have to play by my rules. Clint could feel the weight of Bennett's words settle like a storm cloud, dark and heavy. The man was dangerous, no doubt about it, but Clint had already faced battles far worse than this. He wasn't going to back down now. I'll take my chances, Clint said firmly, taking a step forward. If you think you can scare me into giving up my land, you've got another thing coming. Bennett's smile never wavered. I hope you're prepared for the consequences. There's more at stake here than you realize. Clint didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked back inside the house, slamming the door behind him. His heart was racing, his mind spinning. He had just faced the very man who could destroy everything, and he knew that this encounter was only the beginning. As Clint paced around the living room, the reality of the situation began to sink in. He had always known that he was fighting against forces bigger than himself, but now it was clear that Bennett wasn't just some outsider trying to buy up land. He was a man with power, dangerous power. And Clint wasn't sure how much longer he could hold out. Lisa had been watching from the window, and when Clint came back inside, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the furrowed brow. She knew something was wrong, and she wasn't going to wait for him to volunteer the information. What happened? She asked, her voice calm but insistent. Clint hesitated for a moment, collecting his thoughts. It's him. The one behind all this. John Bennett. Lisa frowned. What did he want? Clint ran a hand through his hair. He's trying to force me into a deal. He thinks he can take everything I've worked for. He's offering me an ultimatum, give him the land or face the consequences. Lisa's expression hardened. And what did you say? I told him no, Clint replied, his voice steady but full of determination. I'm not going to roll over. Not for him. Not for anyone. Lisa walked over to him and put a hand on his arm. You're right not to give in. But Clint, we can't do this alone. You're not fighting just for the ranch anymore. You're fighting for everything you've built. For your future. For us. Clint met her gaze, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift off his shoulders. She was right. This wasn't just about the land, it was about everything that mattered to him. His family. His friends. His future with Lisa. He couldn't let someone like Bennett take it all away. I won't give up, Clint said quietly, but there was a resolve in his voice that hadn't been there before. But we need to be ready for what comes next. Lisa nodded. We will be. We'll fight this together. I'm not going anywhere. The next few days were spent in a whirlwind of preparation. Clint and Sam worked tirelessly to gather information about Bennett and his connections. They dug through legal documents, spoke to anyone who might have information, and tried to track down any potential weaknesses in Bennett's strategy. But as the days passed, it became clear that Bennett was no ordinary adversary. He had resources, influence, and the kind of power that made Clint's blood run cold. Lisa, too, threw herself into the fight. She helped Clint organize the ranch's finances, made calls to people who might be able to help, and supported him every step of the way. But even she could sense the pressure mounting. There were moments when Clint's eyes seemed distant, lost in thought, like he was preparing for something far worse than what they had faced so far. The more they learned about Bennett, the more they realized just how deeply he was entrenched in the world of power and politics. He was a man who didn't hesitate to use every tool at his disposal to get what he wanted, whether that meant bending the law, using intimidation, or manipulating public opinion. And Clint wasn't sure how to fight against that. By the end of the week, Clint had his answer. It wasn't going to be enough to fight Bennett on his own turf. Clint would need to gather his allies, bring in people who had experience with power on that level. He would need to build a strategy that could stand up to the storm Bennett was about to unleash. But the storm was already here. That night, as Clint lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, he thought back to his conversation with Bennett. The man's words echoed in his mind, "You'll have to play by my rules." Clint had always prided himself on playing his own game. But now, it was clear that the rules had changed. If he was going to win this fight, he would have to outsmart Bennett, play the game in ways he never had before. And Clint Eastwood wasn't afraid of a challenge. Clint's thoughts were sharp, each one cutting through the haze of doubt and fear that had settled over him since Bennett's visit. He couldn't afford to make mistakes now. Everything he had built, everything he had fought for, was at stake. It was no longer just about the ranch, it was about the values that had shaped his life, the integrity that had always guided him. And he couldn't allow a man like Bennett to take all that away with a single business deal. The next morning, Clint sat in the small kitchen with a cup of coffee in hand. The warm steam rose from the mug, and for a brief moment, he felt a sense of peace, almost as if the chaos outside his walls could be shut out. But then his thoughts turned to the task at hand. He needed to come up with a strategy, something that would put him back in control. Lisa walked in, her presence steadying him as always. She was the rock he had always relied on, and this fight would be no different. He wasn't going to face it alone. "What's the plan, Clint?" she asked, setting a fresh pot of coffee down and sitting across from him. Her eyes were focused, and she wasn't going to let him slip into despair. Clint took a long sip of his coffee and exhaled slowly. "We need to outsmart Bennett. We can't beat him with brute force or just legal tactics. He's too connected. Too powerful. But if we play it smart, if we hit him where it hurts, we can make him back down." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "You've got something in mind?" Clint set his mug down, leaning forward. "I've been thinking about the one thing he might not have considered. He's overconfident. He thinks he can take what he wants and walk away. But he's underestimated how far I'm willing to go to protect this place." "You're thinking about the land, aren't you?" Lisa said, her voice soft but knowing. Clint nodded slowly. "Exactly. Bennett thinks he's got all the power, that he's the one holding the cards. But I know this land, this community. I've spent my whole life here. And there's something powerful about the people who care about this place. We might not have the money or the connections he does, but we've got something he'll never be able to buy, loyalty. This ranch isn't just about land. It's about everything we've built here, the history of this place, and the people who are invested in it." Lisa was quiet for a moment, letting the words sink in. "So you're saying we need to turn the tables on him, show him that he's not the only one who can play the game?" "Exactly. We're going to make him think he's winning, and then we'll hit him where it counts. We'll use the system against him, but we'll also use the people who are on our side, people who care about this place." Lisa nodded, her eyes lighting up with understanding. "We need to get the community involved, then. If we can rally enough support, Bennett won't be able to take the ranch without facing consequences." Clint smiled, a genuine, determined smile. "That's the plan. It won't be easy, but it's the only way we stand a chance." Over the next few days, Clint and Lisa reached out to everyone they could. They spoke with local farmers, ranchers, and even town officials. They weren't asking for direct confrontation with Bennett, yet. What they needed was support, people who were willing to stand with them, people who saw the bigger picture. If they could prove that Bennett's actions were harming not just Clint, but the entire community, they might be able to use that as leverage. Sam played a key role in helping Clint navigate through the legal aspects. He spent hours poring over old land records, hunting for discrepancies in the contracts Bennett had tried to force through. There was something about Bennett's deal that felt off, like it had been rushed, as if the man wasn't expecting anyone to actually read through the fine print. Sam's persistence paid off when he uncovered a loophole, a small but crucial detail that could be used to challenge the validity of Bennett's claims. "This is it, Clint," Sam said one evening, holding up a file with a triumphant grin. "Bennett's been trying to push this deal through with some pretty questionable paperwork. If we file this with the right people, it could slow him down long enough for us to take a more aggressive approach." Clint's eyes lit up as he took the file from Sam. "Good work, Sam. This could give us the breathing room we need." As the days went on, the tension in the air only increased. Clint could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him, but he also felt a sense of clarity. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was in control of the situation. He wasn't just reacting to Bennett's moves, he was making his own play. And with Lisa, Sam, and the community behind him, Clint knew he could fight this battle. One afternoon, as Clint stood by the fence line, looking out over the vast acres of the ranch, he felt a deep sense of connection to the land beneath his feet. This was his legacy, his father's legacy. It wasn't just about dirt and cattle, it was about something much deeper. It was about pride, about family, and about the people who had worked alongside him for years. He had fought hard to get here, and there was no way he was going to let Bennett or anyone else take it from him. The phone rang, pulling Clint from his thoughts. He glanced at the caller ID and saw it was Lisa. "Hey," Clint answered, his voice steady. "Clint, you're not going to believe this," Lisa said, her voice tight. "I just got off the phone with someone from the county. It's about Bennett. They've uncovered something big." Clint's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "He's been using his influence to pressure local officials into signing off on land deals that have been questionable, at best. Some of it's bordering on illegal. We might have enough evidence now to not only stop him, but to get him investigated." Clint's heart raced. This was the breakthrough they needed, the tipping point that could turn the tide in their favor. "Get the files. We're going to use this." That night, Clint met with Lisa and Sam to go over the evidence. As they reviewed the documents, it became clear that Bennett had been operating under false pretenses, manipulating the system to his advantage. With the information they had, they could bring the fight to his doorstep, legally, but also in a way that would damage his reputation in the community. If they could make enough noise, they could expose him for the fraud he truly was. Clint looked at his team, feeling a surge of hope. This is it. This is our shot. But even as hope flared within him, Clint knew that this was just the beginning. The battle ahead would be harder than anything he had faced before. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't alone. He had the people he loved by his side, and that was worth more than any fight he could ever win. The following week felt like an eternity. Clint's plan was taking shape, but the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on him. Every day, the pressure mounted. Every night, Clint lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they were doing enough. It wasn't just the ranch that was at risk anymore, it was the very essence of what he had built. Lisa had been a constant source of strength. She kept things organized, made phone calls, reached out to the community members who could help. As much as Clint tried to keep his fears at bay, it was hard not to notice the unease growing in her eyes as well. Even with all the support they had managed to rally, Bennett was still a formidable opponent. Sam had become Clint's right-hand man in the legal battle. While Clint focused on talking to people and getting the word out, Sam worked tirelessly to find legal loopholes that could slow Bennett's progress. The county's discovery of Bennett's shady dealings had certainly shifted the playing field, but Clint knew that Bennett wouldn't go down without a fight. One cold afternoon, the phone call that Clint had been waiting for finally came through. Lisa answered it in the kitchen, her voice low but steady as she spoke with someone on the other end. Clint's heart pounded in his chest as he sat at the kitchen table, waiting for the verdict. Lisa hung up the phone and turned toward him, a thoughtful look on her face. "That was Jane from the county office," she said, her tone serious. "She's got more information on Bennett's deals. This time, it's not just land. He's been bribing local politicians to push through projects that harm the environment." If we can prove this, it could ruin his standing in the community. Clint leaned forward, his mind working at full speed. This could be the break we need. If we can get that evidence and bring it to the media, we might be able to expose Bennett as the fraud he is. Lisa nodded. Exactly. But it's risky. Bennett's influence runs deep. He has connections with everyone, from the local press to the sheriff's department. If we move too fast, we might not be able to protect ourselves. Clint didn't hesitate. We don't have a choice. We need to go public with this. It's our only shot at turning the tide. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Lisa worked on gathering the necessary documents from Jane, while Sam put together a legal strategy to ensure they were in the strongest position possible. They reached out to a few trusted allies in the media who could help spread the word if things went south. The most dangerous part of all this was the timing. Clint had to make sure that Bennett's corruption was exposed in such a way that it would destroy his reputation without triggering a backlash. If they were too aggressive too soon, it could make Bennett look like the victim, and Clint couldn't afford that. On the morning they were set to release the information to the press, Clint found himself standing at the front door of the ranch, staring out at the vast horizon. It was a moment of clarity. It wasn't just about saving the ranch anymore, it was about protecting everything that made this land sacred. His father's legacy, the hard work of every rancher and farmer who had come before him, and the future that he and Lisa had dreamed of building together. They were about to face the storm head-on, and Clint was ready. "Everything's ready," Lisa's voice broke through his thoughts. She was standing beside him now, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Are you sure about this?" Clint looked down at her, his gaze unwavering. "We don't have a choice, Lisa. This is the only way to beat Bennett." Later that day, the press release went out. The story was picked up quickly by local news outlets, and soon, the broader media was covering the corruption scandals surrounding Bennett. Clint and Lisa made their rounds, speaking to reporters and making sure the facts were clear. It wasn't just a land grab, it was a systematic attempt to manipulate the local government, to buy power and control at the expense of the environment, the community, and the people who had worked the land for generations. The impact was immediate. Bennett's name was dragged through the mud, and local politicians began distancing themselves from him. It wasn't long before the pressure started to mount. Clint could see it in the way Bennett's people reacted. There were frantic calls, frantic attempts to shut down the story. But Clint wasn't about to let it die. He had made a promise to himself that he would fight for what was right, no matter the cost. The day after the media storm broke, Clint received an unexpected visitor. It was an older man, weathered and wrinkled by years of ranching, someone Clint knew well. His name was Charlie Adams, a neighbor who had been running his own ranch for over 30 years. Charlie stepped off his weathered truck and waved as Clint approached. "Clint, got a minute?" His voice was low, but there was an urgency to it that Clint couldn't ignore. "Of course, Charlie," Clint said, shaking his hand. "What's on your mind?" Charlie's expression was serious. "I just came from town. Word's getting around about Bennett, and it ain't good. People are starting to talk. They're seeing it for what it is, Clint. The man's been running roughshod over this whole town for years, and now the truth's out." Clint felt a wave of relief, but it was fleeting. "That's good to hear, but it's not enough. We need more. We need people who are willing to stand up and make their voices heard." Charlie nodded. "I know. That's why I'm here. You're not alone in this fight. I've got my ranch, but I've been talking to folks. We're with you. You need help taking him down. You got it." Clint's heart swelled with gratitude. "Thanks, Charlie. That means more than you know." Over the next few days, Clint watched as more and more members of the community began to stand with him. Farmers, ranchers, and even some of the town's elders pledged their support. They weren't just backing Clint, they were backing the land. They were backing the values of hard work, honesty, and integrity that Bennett had tried to crush. But even as the community rallied, Clint knew the fight was far from over. Bennett wasn't the type to back down easily. He would retaliate, of that, Clint was certain. The storm was only gathering strength, and Clint would have to be ready for whatever came next. As Clint looked out over the horizon once more, he felt the weight of the battle ahead. But now, for the first time in weeks, he also felt something else, hope. They weren't just fighting for the ranch. They were fighting for a future. And Clint wasn't going to lose. The storm Clint had anticipated was approaching faster than he had expected. What had started as a local media frenzy had quickly gained traction, drawing the attention of city officials, business tycoons, and even environmental activists. As the story spread beyond the county line, Clint began to feel the weight of the battle, not just for the ranch, but for the very future of his way of life. Lisa had been busy orchestrating interviews, handling calls from local reporters, and speaking with the community leaders who were rallying behind them. Each day, more people came forward to show their support, neighbors, ranchers, even people who had known Clint's father. It was as if a dam had broken, and the flood of outrage against Bennett's tactics was unstoppable. Yet, for every person who stepped forward in solidarity, there were whispers of concern. While the truth about Bennett was being uncovered, there was a sense that the fight was far from over. Bennett wasn't the kind of man to go down quietly, and Clint knew he would use every resource at his disposal to retaliate. That evening, Clint sat in the dimly lit living room, his mind racing. Lisa sat beside him, her fingers intertwined with his. She had been a pillar of support, but even she was beginning to feel the strain of everything. The phone rang, cutting through the silence like a knife. Clint answered it on the second ring. "Clint Eastwood," he said, his voice steady. "Clint, it's Sam. You need to come down to the courthouse, now." Sam's voice was urgent, and Clint could tell something was wrong. "They're about to pull a fast one, and you're not going to like it." Clint's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" "They've filed a lawsuit. Bennett's lawyers are trying to get an injunction against you. They're claiming that the press release caused irreparable harm to their client's reputation. They're asking for a temporary restraining order to stop the media from further covering the story until a full investigation can take place." Clint was already standing, the adrenaline kicking in. "Damn it, Sam. We can't let him get away with this." "I know," Sam said. "But we need to act fast. Meet me at the courthouse. Bring Lisa, too. We're going to need her to help with the media push." By the time Clint and Lisa arrived at the courthouse, a crowd had gathered outside. Reporters were huddled in groups, cameras flashing, microphones extended toward anyone who would speak. Inside, Clint could hear the commotion of attorneys and officials discussing the case. Bennett's lawyers were a formidable force, and Clint knew that this was just another step in Bennett's strategy to wear them down. Sam was already waiting for them in the hallway, his face grim. "It's not just the media they're after, Clint. They're trying to freeze everything. Bennett knows that if the story dies down, he can regroup and hit us harder. We can't let that happen." Clint nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Let's do this. We need to hit them with everything we've got." The moment they entered the courtroom, Clint felt the weight of the room settle on him. Bennett's team was seated at one side, a slick group of attorneys who looked as though they were born to fight dirty. On the other side, Clint, Lisa, and Sam sat at the defense table, facing down a legal battle that could have far-reaching consequences. The judge, a stern woman in her early 50s, called the court to order. "We are here to hear the matter of Bennett Enterprises versus Clint Eastwood. Mr. Eastwood, do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Clint stood, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been through many tense situations before, but this one felt different. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a fight for everything he held dear. He cleared his throat and addressed the judge. Your Honor, I understand that this case is being presented as an issue of defamation. But the truth is not defamation. What Mr. Bennett is trying to do is silence the truth, his own corruption, his manipulation of local officials, and his attempts to buy land through underhanded tactics. I am here today not just to defend myself, but to defend the integrity of this community and the people who have lived and worked here for generations. The courtroom fell silent. Clint could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. It wasn't just about the ranch anymore, it was about standing up for what was right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Bennett's attorney, a slick man in a tailored suit, stood up. Your Honor, the claims that Mr. Eastwood is making are unfounded and based purely on conjecture. There is no evidence of wrongdoing on our part. Mr. Eastwood's public statements have already caused significant harm to our client's reputation, and we believe the press should be barred from continuing to report on this matter until the facts are fully examined. Clint could feel his anger rising, but he remained composed. The facts are clear. Mr. Bennett is a criminal. We have the evidence to prove it. His attempt to silence the truth is an insult to the hard-working people of this town. The judge looked between both parties, her face unreadable. I will take both arguments into consideration. This hearing will be recessed until tomorrow at 9 a.m. I suggest both sides be prepared with additional documentation to support their claims. Clint turned to Sam, his mind racing. We have to be ready for tomorrow. We need to counter everything they're saying and make sure the press stays on our side. Sam nodded, a determined look in his eyes. We've got this, Clint. It's time to take the fight to them. The next day, as the hearing resumed, Clint could feel the stakes growing higher. He knew that Bennett's team wouldn't back down, and they were doing everything they could to muddy the waters. But Clint had one thing that Bennett didn't have: people who were willing to stand with him, willing to fight for the truth. Lisa stood beside Clint, a calm presence in the storm of the courtroom. As the day wore on, more evidence came to light, documents that proved Bennett's connections to corrupt politicians, evidence of illegal land deals, and even photos of shady meetings he had tried to keep under wraps. It was a breakthrough, and Clint knew it. By the time the judge called for a break, Clint was exhausted, but he couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. They were winning. Slowly, but surely, they were gaining ground. That evening, as Clint and Lisa walked back to their truck, the weight of the day began to settle over him. The battle wasn't over, far from it. But for the first time, Clint felt like they had the upper hand. Bennett was still powerful, still dangerous, but Clint wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. We're getting closer, Clint, Lisa said, her voice steady. Clint squeezed her hand. We're not stopping until we win. This ranch, this town, they're worth fighting for. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch. Clint stood by the fence, his eyes locked on the land that had been in his family for generations. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, this place had felt like it might slip away forever. Now, with every passing day, the battle was inching closer to its final resolution. The courtroom battle with Bennett Enterprises had reached its climax. The press had been relentless, and with every new piece of evidence that came to light, Clint felt the tide turning in their favor. But nothing in this fight had been easy, and nothing was certain. Bennett's team was still trying to undermine everything Clint had worked for, pulling out every trick in the book. But Clint had one thing Bennett didn't: the truth. That morning, as Clint and Lisa prepared to head back to court for the final hearing, the atmosphere in the ranch house was quiet but charged with anticipation. There was no more room for hesitation. The community had rallied behind them, the media had their full attention, and the legal team was ready to finish the job. This wasn't just about saving the ranch anymore. It was about making sure Bennett couldn't destroy the town, couldn't continue to manipulate people for his own gain. Lisa stood in the doorway, looking at Clint with determination in her eyes. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. Clint paused for a moment, his hand resting on the fence, feeling the cool morning air brush against his face. "I've never been more ready," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. "Let's finish this." The courtroom was packed. There were more reporters, more community members, more people than Clint had ever seen in the courthouse before. This was it, the moment of truth. The judge, a stern woman who had presided over the case for the past few days, called the session to order. "Let's get started," she said. "This is the final hearing in the case of Bennett Enterprises versus Clint Eastwood. Both sides will have one final opportunity to present their arguments before we proceed with a decision." Bennett's attorney stood first, his smug expression unchanged. "Your Honor, we've presented more than enough evidence to show that Mr. Eastwood's claims are based on nothing but speculation and falsehoods. We ask that you dismiss all charges against our client and issue an injunction against further media coverage, as we have shown how irreparable the damage to our client's reputation has been." Clint felt his blood pressure rise, but he remained calm. This was what they had been preparing for. This was the moment they had been working towards. Standing up, Clint felt a surge of energy, of resolve. It was his time to speak, and he wasn't going to back down. He took a deep breath and addressed the court. "Your Honor," Clint began, his voice carrying the weight of everything he had been through, everything that had led him to this point. "What we've shown over the course of this trial is simple: Bennett Enterprises is a corporation built on lies and corruption. The man sitting across from me is not only responsible for the destruction of the land, but he has manipulated local officials and used his wealth and power to deceive this community. What we've presented is not a series of accusations, it's hard evidence, facts, and testimonies that back up every single claim." Clint paused, letting his words sink in. The courtroom was silent, the tension palpable. "You've heard the testimonies. You've seen the evidence. You know the truth. Bennett may be able to afford fancy lawyers and buy his way out of a lot of things, but he can't erase the truth. He can't erase the lives he's ruined, the land he's tried to steal, and the damage he's done to this town. My family, my community, this land, is worth more than any dollar he can throw at us." Clint's eyes swept across the room, meeting the gaze of several of the community members who had come to show their support. He could see it in their faces, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for all of them. "I'm not here for vengeance, Your Honor," Clint continued, his voice steady, but filled with conviction. "I'm here because this is what's right. This town deserves better. This land deserves better. And as long as I have breath in my lungs, I will fight to protect it." The room was still. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. Clint could see the judge considering his words carefully, the weight of the decision clearly on her shoulders. The court had heard both sides. It was now up to her to decide what happened next. Bennett's attorney shot Clint a sharp look, but Clint didn't flinch. This was the end of the line for him. There was no more room for doubt. He had done everything he could. After a long pause, the judge spoke. "I have heard both arguments, and I have reviewed the evidence presented in this case. This is a complicated matter, but it is also clear that the truth has come to light. Mr. Eastwood's claims are supported by evidence. It is clear that Mr. Bennett's actions have harmed this community, and I believe it is in the best interest of the people that this matter be fully addressed." Clint's heart raced. Lisa's hand found his, and they squeezed it, waiting for the final words. "I am issuing an immediate injunction against Mr. Bennett's enterprises. Any attempt to interfere with the ongoing investigation or silence further reporting on this case will result in severe penalties. Furthermore, I am directing that the evidence presented here be handed over to the appropriate authorities for further investigation into Mr. Bennett's business practices." Clint stood tall, his pulse quickening. He had done it. The court had ruled in their favor. Bennett's empire was crumbling. As the courtroom began to empty, Clint and Lisa stood there for a moment, just taking it all in. They had won. The ranch was safe. The community was safe. Bennett had been exposed for the fraud he was.